"Release her," the voice said, and it didn't rise above the clatter of glasses or the low hum of men trading lies over cheap whiskey. But it cut through the room all the same, the kind of quiet that didn't ask for attention. It took it, and every head in that Deadwood saloon turned not because they heard it, but because they felt it settle into the bones of the place like a change in weather before a storm. And near the center of the room, where dust floated in narrow beams of late afternoon light, a young Apache woman stood with her wrists bound in coarse rope, her dark hair tangled from travel, her chin lifted just enough to show she hadn't given them what they wanted, not fear, not yet, and the men around her, thick-shouldered, loud, the kind who laughed too easily when someone else stood alone, paused mid-sentence as the stranger stepped forward from the doorway, boots slow against the wooden floor. Coat carrying the pale memory of miles walked under a relentless sun, his hat low, shadowing a face no one there could place, which in a town like Deadwood meant more than if they could, because names were currency, and a man without one either had nothing or nothing left to lose. And one of the men holding the rope smirked, rolling his shoulders like he'd been waiting for a moment to make an example out of someone new. "You lost, friend?" he asked, voice thick with amusement that didn't quite reach his eyes. But the gunslinger didn't answer right away, didn't reach for the iron resting easy at his side, didn't even look at the man who'd spoken. Instead, his gaze moved past them, steady, unhurried, landing on the woman as if the rest of the room had already been decided. And for a brief second something shifted there, something too small for anyone else to catch. A flicker of recognition or maybe memory, like a photograph left too long in the sun, and then it was gone, and he stepped closer, one pace, then another, until the boards beneath his boots stopped, creaking and the silence thickened around him. And when he spoke again, it wasn't louder, just clearer, "Release her." And this time the words didn't drift, they settled, and a few men near the bar exchanged glances, not out of agreement, but because something in the way he said it didn't leave room for laughter. Not yet. Though one of the older men, gray at the temples and used to being the loudest voice in any room, let out a dry chuckle anyway. "You new here?" he said, leaning back against the bar with the ease of someone who'd never been told no and meant it. "Out here, we don't take orders from ghosts." And a ripple of quiet amusement followed, thin and uncertain, like the first drops of rain before a long drought breaks. But the stranger only reached into his coat, slow enough that every pair of eyes tracked the movement, not out of fear, but out of habit, and instead of a weapon, he placed something small onto the nearest table, the wood worn smooth by years of restless hands, and the object caught the light just enough to glint, silver against the dust, a simple chain with a pendant shaped like a narrow oval, scratched from use, but still holding its shine where it mattered. And for a heartbeat no one spoke, because the woman lifted her head, just slightly, and her eyes locked onto that piece of silver like it had weight beyond metal, like it carried something no one else in the room could see. And the man at the bar straightened, his smile thinning. "That's supposed to mean something?" he asked, but there was a crack in it now, a question he hadn't intended to ask out loud. And the gunslinger finally turned his head, slow, deliberate, meeting the man's gaze within. Expression that didn't change, not even a flicker. "It already does," he said, and somewhere near the back a chair scraped against the floor, sharp in the stillness, and the rope in the Apache woman's hands tightened for just a second before loosening again, as if the man holding it had forgotten what he was doing. And outside, beyond the swinging doors, the wind shifted, carrying dust across the street in a long, quiet line, the kind that erased footprints without asking who they belonged to. And inside, without a single gun drawn, without a single shout raised, something heavier than fear began to settle over the room, something closer to understanding, though no one there was ready to admit it. Yet, not until the stranger took one more step forward and the chain on the table caught the light again, brighter this time, like it had been waiting to be seen. The chain did not belong in a place like this, too clean, too deliberate, and the longer it sat under the thin blade of sunlight cutting through the saloon window, the more it seemed to draw the room inward, like everything loud and careless about Deadwood had suddenly found something it could not swallow. And Elias Crow stood there with his hands resting easy at his sides, not tense, not reaching, just present in a way that made men used to filling space feel like they were standing on borrowed ground, and the man holding the rope shifted his grip, glancing down at the Apache woman as if seeing her for the first time not as trouble, but as a question he had not bothered to ask, and she did not move, did not plead, her eyes fixed on the silver piece like it carried a voice only she could hear, and when she finally spoke, it was soft, but it carried farther than any shout in the room. "You should not have come," she said, her English careful, shaped by distance and memory, and Elias tilted his head just enough to catch it, not surprised, not offended, just acknowledging it like a man acknowledging the wind. "I was already on my way," he answered, and that was when the gray-templed man pushed off the bar, boots heavy against the floor as he stepped closer, his presence trying to reclaim the space that had slipped from him. "You saying you know her?" he asked, and the question hung there, sharp, because knowing her would change everything, would turn a nameless stranger into something else entirely, something with a stake, something that could be weighed and measured and dismissed. But Elias did not answer the question the way they expected. He did not offer a story or a claim. He simply reached out and turned the chain with 2 fingers so the pendant faced upward, and for the first time the engraving caught the light, faint but clear enough, a small mark, hand-cut, not perfect, but precise in its own way, and a murmur moved through the room, not recognition, not yet, but discomfort, because that kind of detail did not come from chance. It came from intention, and the man at the bar frowned, leaning closer. "Where did you get that?" he asked, and Elias finally looked at him fully, his eyes steady, carrying something older than the dust on his coat. "I gave it to someone," he said, and he let the words sit, did not rush them, did not soften them. Someone who knew what it meant to carry more than they should. And the Apache woman closed her eyes for a brief second, as if the words had weight, as if they pressed against something she had been holding in place for longer than this room had existed. And when she opened them again, there was no fear there, only a quiet understanding that did not belong to the men around her. And the rope slackened another inch, unnoticed by the one who held it, and the gray-templed man exhaled through his nose, impatience creeping back into his voice like a habit he trusted more than uncertainty. "We are not here for your stories," he said. "We are here because a man is gone, and she was there when it happened," and a few heads nodded, not out of certainty, but because the statement gave them something solid to stand on again, something simpler than the silence that had taken hold, and Elias listened, not interrupting, not challenging, just letting the words land where they fell, and then he nodded once, slow, as if agreeing with something only he could see. "Then you should hear the rest of it," he said, and that was when the tension shifted. Again, not outward this time, but inward, pulling tighter, because there was a difference between a man denying a claim and a man inviting the truth to be spoken. And one of the younger men near the door shifted his weight, glancing toward the exit as if measuring distance without meaning to, and outside the wind pressed against the building, low and steady, like it was waiting for something to give, and Elias reached into his coat once more. Not hurried, not dramatic, just deliberate, and for a moment every breath in the room seemed to pause, not because they expected a weapon, but because they did not know what to expect at all, and that uncertainty was heavier than any threat. And when his hand came back into the light, it held nothing more than a folded piece of worn leather, edges softened from use, and he set it beside the chain with the same care, as if placing something back where it belonged, and the Apache woman's gaze dropped to it, and this time her breath caught, just barely, enough for Elias to hear, enough for him to know that the room was no longer deciding her fate. It was waiting for his next word, and in that waiting, in that fragile, stretched moment where no one moved and no one spoke, the power shifted without a single hand raised, settling not on the loudest voice or the strongest arm, but on the man who had said the least and meant it the most. The leather piece rested beside the chain like something that had traveled farther than any man in that room, worn at the edges, darkened by time and hands that had carried it through sun and storm, and no one reached for it. Not yet, because even the men who had spent their lives taking what they wanted understood when something was not theirs to touch, and Elias Crow stood with the same stillness he had carried through the door, not claiming space, not surrendering it, simply holding it, until the truth had somewhere to land, and the gray-templed man narrowed his eyes, leaning closer as if proximity could give him control again. "You are going to tell us what that is," he said, voice lower now, less certain than before, and Elias gave a small nod, not in submission, but in agreement with the moment itself, and he opened the leather slowly, unfolding it with care that felt almost out of place in a room built on rough edges, and inside, pressed flat against the worn interior, was a second marking, faint but deliberate, the same hand-cut pattern as the pendant, but older, deeper, etched with the kind of patience that did not belong to hurried men, and the Apache woman's breath steadied as she looked at it, her shoulders easing just enough to show that whatever weight she had been carrying was no longer hers alone, and Elias spoke, his voice even, unforced. "This was given to my brother when he could not stand on his own," he said, and the words moved through the room. Like a slow current, not dramatic, not loud, but impossible to ignore, and a few of the men exchanged glances again, not mocking this time, but measuring, because the story they had been holding on to did not leave room for details like that, and the man by the rope shifted his stance, his grip loosening another inch without him noticing, and Elias continued, not looking at the men now, but at the woman, as if the truth belonged more to her than to anyone else. "He was sick," he said, "not the kind that shows on the outside, not the kind a doctor in a clean coat could fix, but the kind that takes a man piece by piece until he forgets who he was supposed to be." And the room listened, because even in a place like Deadwood, where stories were traded cheap and often, there was something about the way he spoke that made this one different, made it cost something to hear, and he lifted the chain slightly, letting it catch the light again. "She found him when no one else would," he said, and now the Apache woman lowered her eyes, not in shame, but in something closer to memory, gave him water when he would not ask for it, sat beside him when the nights stretched too long, and when the time came, she did not leave, and a quiet settled deeper into the room, heavier than before, because the shape of the story had changed, and the men could feel it even if they did not yet understand it, and the gray-templed man exhaled slowly, shaking his head as if trying to push the words aside. "That does not change what happened," he said, but there was less force behind it now, less certainty, and Elias did not argue, did not raise his voice, he simply nodded again, acknowledging the statement without giving it power. "No," he said, "it does not." And then he placed the chain back on the table, letting it rest between them like a line no one had drawn but everyone could see. "But it changes how you understand it." And the Apache woman finally spoke again, her voice steady, carrying none of the strain that had been there before. "He walked into the river," she said, and the words were simple, but they held something vast behind them, something that did not need explanation to be felt. And Elias did not look surprised, did not react as if hearing it for the first time. He simply listened, and one of the younger men near the door swallowed hard, his eyes flicking toward the others as if searching for something to hold on to, some version of events that fit better in his hands, and the man by the rope let it slip just a little more, enough that the tension in it eased, enough that the woman's wrists were no longer pulled tight, and outside the wind pressed again, stronger this time, rattling the loose edge of a shutter, a dry sound that echoed through the silence inside, and Elias took a slow breath, not heavy, not dramatic, just enough to mark the moment, and when he spoke again, it was softer than before, but it carried farther. "He was not alone," he said, and the room seemed to lean in without moving, because now they understood that whatever came next would decide more than just the fate of the woman in front of them. It would decide what kind of men they were willing to be when the truth stood quietly in front of them and asked nothing but to be seen. The words did not echo, they settled, and for a long moment no one in that room moved, as if even shifting their weight might break something fragile that had finally come into view. And Elias Crow let the silence do what it was meant to do, because out here silence was not empty. It was where truth either stood or collapsed, and the Apache woman kept her eyes forward now, no longer searching, no longer bracing, just standing as someone who had carried her part and set it down at last, and the man with the gray at his temples rubbed a hand along his jaw, slower than before, his confidence thinning like dust in the wind. "People do not just walk into a river," he said, but it sounded less like a challenge and more like something he needed to believe, and Elias did not argue the words. He simply looked at him, steady, patient. "Sometimes they do," he said, "when the weight they carry feels heavier than the ground beneath them." And a few men near the back lowered their gaze, not because they understood completely, but because they understood enough to feel the edges of something they had ignored before. And the rope slipped another inch from the hands that held it until it rested loose, no longer a restraint, just a piece of fiber without purpose. And the man who had been holding it seemed to notice it only then, glancing down as if unsure when it had stopped being necessary. And the Apache woman did not pull away, did not step back. She simply let her hands remain where they were, calm, unhurried, as if she knew the moment would unfold without force. And Elias reached forward, not fast, not sudden, just deliberate. And with 2 fingers he lifted the rope from her wrists, easing it free in a motion so simple it barely made a sound. And no one stopped him, not because they could not, but because something in the room had already decided it would not. And the gray-templed man exhaled slowly, looking around as if expecting someone else to speak, someone else to reclaim the ground that had shifted beneath them. But no one did, because each man there felt the same quiet truth settling in, that what they had built their certainty on was thinner than they had believed. And outside, a wagon rolled past, its wheels creaking over hard dirt, the ordinary sound slipping into the saloon like a reminder that the world beyond this moment had not changed, only the people inside it had. And Elias set the rope down on the table beside the chain and the leather, placing it there as if it belonged among them, another object carrying a meaning it had not been given before. And he stepped back half a pace, not retreating, not advancing, simply allowing space for the room to breathe again. And the Apache woman lowered her hands slowly, flexing her fingers once as if returning them to herself. And when she looked up, she did not look at the men who had bound her. She looked at Elias, not with gratitude, not with debt, but with recognition, the kind that does not need words to be understood. And Elias gave a small nod in return, the kind that closes something without needing to explain it. And the gray-templed man cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet. "If what you are saying is true," he began, but the sentence did not finish the way he had intended, because there was no place left for the accusation he had been holding, only the question of what came next. And that question hung heavier than anything that had come before it. And one of the younger men near the door shifted his hat in his hands, glancing toward the woman, then toward Elias, as if seeing both of them for the first time without the weight of assumption. And the man who had held the rope stepped back, just one step, but it was enough to change where he stood in the room, enough to show that whatever line had been drawn before no longer held him in the same place. And Elias watched it all without expression, not claiming victory, not demanding anything, because this was not about winning. It was about leaving something behind that could not be undone. And after a moment he reached for the chain, lifting it gently, and held it out toward the Apache woman, offering it back without a word. And she hesitated only a fraction of a second before taking it, her fingers closing around the silver as if it belonged there, as if it always had. And the light caught it once more, softer now, no longer sharp, no longer demanding attention, just present. And Elias turned then, not waiting for thanks, not looking back. And as he stepped toward the door, the room parted without anyone being told to move, the path opening in quiet understanding. And when he reached the threshold, he paused, just long enough to let the outside light fall across the floor behind him. And in that brief stillness, every man in that saloon felt the same thing settle into place, not loud, not forced, but undeniable, that the moment they had just lived through would follow them long after the dust had settled. Because out here, where words were cheap and actions cost everything, it only took one man willing to stand still and speak the truth to change what justice looked like without ever drawing a gun. The door swung once behind him and settled into a slow creak as it closed, and the sound lingered longer than it should have, like the room was not ready to let go of the moment that had just passed through it. And for a few seconds no one spoke, no one moved, as if each man was measuring something inside himself he had not planned to confront that day. And the Apache woman stood where he had left her, the chain resting in her palm, her fingers curled around it, not tightly, not possessively, just enough to feel its weight. And when she lifted it slightly, the light caught the silver again, softer now, no longer demanding attention, just reflecting it. and the man with the gray at his temples cleared his throat once more, but this time there was no authority in it, only the habit of someone used to filling silence. "That does not settle everything," he said, though the words did not carry far, and no one answered him, not even the men who had stood closest to him before, because something had shifted that could not be pushed back into place with a sentence, and the younger man near the door finally spoke, his voice uncertain. "What if he was telling the truth?" he said, and the question did not land like a challenge. It landed like a door opening that no one had realized was there, and the gray-templed man looked at him, then at the woman, then at the empty space where Elias had stood, and for the first time since he had walked into that room, the older man had no immediate answer, and that absence carried more weight than anything he had said before, and the man who had held the rope bent slightly, picking it up from the table, turning it in his hands as if trying to remember what it had meant a few minutes ago, and finding that it did not mean the same thing anymore. And he set it back down again, quieter this time, almost careful, and the Apache woman stepped forward then, not quickly, not cautiously, just with the steady pace of someone who had already decided where she was going. And as she moved, the men parted without thinking, not out of fear, but out of something closer to respect, though none of them would have used that word out loud. And she stopped near the table, looking at the leather and the chain, then at the men around her, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm it had before. "You wanted justice," she said, and the words did not accuse, they simply existed. "But you did not ask what it looked like." And the room held that sentence the way it had held his, quietly, letting it settle where it needed to, and the younger man lowered his gaze, his hat turning slowly in his hands, and the gray-templed man exhaled again, longer this time, his shoulders dropping just a fraction as if something he had been holding had finally been set down without his permission, and outside, a horse shifted its weight against the hitching post, the soft clink of metal carrying through the open cracks of the building, ordinary, grounding, and inside, the air felt different, not lighter, but clearer, as if the dust itself had chosen to settle, and the Apache woman reached out, taking the leather piece from the table, folding it carefully the way it had been before, then placing it back beside the chain as if returning it to a story that did not belong to her alone, and she turned then, following the path that had opened, and no one stopped her, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to demand, nothing left to prove, and as she stepped toward the door, the light from outside fell across her face, catching the edge of the silver in her hand, and for a moment she paused, not looking back at the men, but at the space where Elias had stood, and there was a stillness there that felt like acknowledgement, like something completed without needing to be named, and then she stepped out into the daylight, and the door swung again, slower this time, closing with a softer sound, and inside the saloon the men remained where they were, not returning to their drinks, not picking up their conversations, because something in them had shifted in a way that did not allow for immediate return, and the gray-templed man finally moved, walking back to the bar with steps that were less certain than before, and he rested his hands on the worn wood, looking down at the surface as if it might offer him an answer, but it did not, because the answer had already been given, not in words, not in force, but in the quiet refusal of one man to let a story end the way it had been decided for him. And somewhere beyond the saloon, beyond the dust and the narrow streets of Deadwood, Elias Crow walked on without looking back, his pace unchanged, his presence already fading into the distance like a shadow at dusk, and yet behind him, in that room he had left, every man carried the same unspoken understanding, that justice did not belong to the loudest voice or the strongest hand, but to the one who chose to stand still when it mattered, and speak only what was true, and leave the rest behind. The sunlight outside Deadwood felt different once you stepped into it, not softer, not warmer, just honest in a way the saloon had not been, and Elias Crow moved through it without slowing, boots pressing quiet into the packed dirt as if he had already left the moment behind him, though the weight of it still followed like a shadow that refused to stretch too far, and the street carried its usual rhythm, a wagon rolling past, a pair of men arguing over the price of grain, a woman shaking dust from a cloth outside a narrow storefront, none of them knowing what had just unfolded behind those wooden doors, none of them needing to, because out here most things passed without witness, and the ones that mattered did not ask for one. And Elias reached the hitching post where his horse waited, a dark bay with a patient stance, the kind that did not spook easy, and he rested a hand along its neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath the dust, grounding, familiar, and for a moment he stood there, not mounting, not moving on, just listening to the town breathe around him. And from behind him the saloon door opened again, slower this time, not with the swing of confrontation, but with the weight of someone choosing to step into something uncertain, and he did not turn right away, because he already knew who it would be, and sure enough, after a few steps on the dirt, the Apache woman came to a stop a few feet behind him, not close enough to crowd, not far enough to be ignored, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because some conversations did not begin with words, they began with the understanding that words might not be enough, and finally she spoke, her voice carrying that same steady calm. "You should have taken it back," she said, and Elias glanced slightly over his shoulder, not fully turning, just enough to acknowledge her presence. "It was never mine to keep," he answered, and she stepped closer then, just one pace, the silver chain catching the sunlight as it rested against her hand. "It was his," she said, "and now it is yours." And Elias exhaled quietly, a breath that carried more memory than hesitation, and he shook his head once, small, final. "No," he said, "it belongs to the one who stayed." And the words settled between them, not heavy, but certain, and she looked at him then, not searching, not questioning, just seeing, and for a brief second something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need to be named to be understood, and behind them, the town carried on, unaware, unconcerned, the way it always did, because Deadwood did not pause for truth. It simply absorbed it and moved on, and she looked down at the chain again, her fingers tightening just slightly, then loosening as if she had made a decision she had not planned to make when she walked out of that saloon. And she stepped forward once more, coming to stand beside him rather than behind, and for a moment they both faced the same direction, the open road stretching beyond the edge of town, pale and endless under the wide sky. And she spoke again, softer this time. "He asked me not to let you carry it," she said, and that made Elias turn, not sharply, but enough to meet her eyes fully for the first time outside the shadow of the saloon. And there was no accusation there, no burden being handed off, only a quiet truth being placed where it belonged. And Elias held that gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if something inside him had finally found its place. And he reached out, not for the chain, but for the leather piece she still carried, and she placed it in his hand without hesitation. And he folded it once, carefully, then slipped it back into his coat where it rested flat against his chest. And when he looked back up, there was something lighter in his expression, not relief, not quite, but something closer to it than before, and he stepped toward his horse, placing a foot in the stirrup, then paused again, glancing back at her one last time. And she stood there in the sunlight, no longer bound, no longer surrounded, just a woman holding her ground in a place that had not expected her to. And he gave a small nod, the kind that closed a chapter without needing to say so, and then he mounted, the leather creaking softly as he settled into the saddle. And with a gentle pull on the reins, the horse turned toward the open road. And as he rode out of Deadwood, the dust rose behind him in a slow, drifting trail, fading as quickly as it formed, and back on the street, the Apache woman watched until he disappeared beyond the bend, and then she turned in the opposite direction, stepping into a path of her own choosing, carrying the silver not as a burden, not as a debt, but as something earned in silence. And somewhere between those two directions, in the space where they had stood side by side for a brief moment, something remained, not visible, not spoken, but felt, the kind of truth that did not belong to one person or one story, but to anyone willing to stand still long enough to recognize it when it arrived. The road out of Deadwood stretched long and pale under the late afternoon sun, a thin ribbon cutting through dry earth and scattered grass that whispered when the wind moved just right. And Elias Crow rode steady along it, not fast, not slow, the kind of pace that did not draw attention and did not invite it either. And behind him the town had already begun to shrink into something smaller than it had felt an hour before, its noise fading into a distant murmur carried off by the breeze. And for a while there was only the sound of hooves pressing into dust, the soft rhythm of leather shifting with each step, and the wide sky above that held everything without asking for explanation. And Elias kept his eyes forward, but his hand drifted once toward his coat, not to check, not to confirm, just to feel the presence of the folded leather resting where it had been placed. A quiet reminder of something finished and something that would not be finished at all, and he let it be, because out here a man learned what to carry and what to leave behind, and neither choice came easy. And back in Deadwood, the dust settled slowly along the main street, drifting through the open spaces between buildings, softening edges, erasing the marks of passing boots and wagon wheels like the town itself preferred not to hold on to anything too long. And the Apache woman moved along that same street now, her steps measured, her gaze forward, not searching for trouble, not avoiding it, simply walking as someone who had already faced what mattered and found it wanting. And a few people glanced at her as she passed, some with curiosity, some with the kind of quiet respect that comes when a story travels faster than words, and others looked away entirely, not ready to meet the reflection of something they had chosen not to see before. And she did not react to any of it, because her path did not belong to them. And near the edge of town, she stopped beside a small water trough, the wood worn smooth by years of use, and she rested her hand along its rim, the coolness of it grounding her in the present. And for a moment she looked down at the chain in her palm, turning it slightly so the engraving caught what little light filtered through the settling dust. And there was no hesitation in her expression, no question, just a quiet acceptance of what it represented now, not loss, not obligation, but something closer to truth. And she slipped it over her head, letting it rest against her chest where it settled naturally, as if it had always been meant to be there. And then she lifted her gaze again, looking out beyond the last buildings of Deadwood, where the land opened wide and unclaimed, and the wind carried the faint scent of sage and distance. And somewhere far ahead, beyond what she could see, a rider moved along that same open stretch, unaware of the eyes that had followed him earlier, unaware of the way his presence had shifted something that would outlast his footsteps. And Elias did not look back, because men like him rarely did, not out of indifference, but because they understood that some things did not need to be checked to remain true. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the land like quiet echoes of the day, he slowed his horse just slightly, letting it find its own rhythm. And in that unhurried motion there was a kind of peace, not loud, not earned through victory, but present in the absence of something heavier that had finally been set down. And behind him, in the town that had already begun to fade from sight, a few men still stood in that saloon, not speaking, not drinking, just existing in a space that no longer felt the same. And one of them reached for a glass, then stopped, his hand hovering for a second before lowering again, because whatever he had come in there to do no longer held the same weight. And the great templed man sat at the bar, his shoulders slightly hunched, his gaze fixed on the worn wood as if trying to read something written there that had not been there before. And the rope still lay on the table, untouched, its purpose gone, its presence a quiet reminder of what had almost been and what had been refused. And outside, life moved on as it always did. Wagons creaked, voices rose and fell, doors opened and closed. But beneath it all there was a subtle shift, something that would not announce itself, something that would not demand recognition, but would remain all the same, carried in the way a man paused before speaking, or the way another chose not to act when he once would have. And out on the open road, Elias Crow rode on into that same quiet truth, not as a man who had changed the world, but as one who had refused to let it stay the same for a single moment. And in the West, that was often enough to leave a mark deeper than any name carved into wood or stone. The sun had dropped lower by the time the land began to change, shadows stretching long across the open plain like quiet reminders that even the day knew when to step back. And Elias Crow rode through that shifting light with the same steady pace, not chasing distance, not avoiding it, just moving forward, because that was what men like him did when there was nothing left behind worth turning toward. And the wind carried a different sound now, softer, brushing through dry grass and long waves that whispered instead of rattled. And somewhere in that quiet, a memory surfaced, not as a sharp edge but as a dull weight, the kind that did not demand attention but refused to disappear entirely. and his hand moved once more toward his coat, pressing lightly against the folded leather beneath it. And for a moment he slowed his horse to a near stop, letting the stillness settle around him fully. Because out here stillness was not empty, it was where a man heard the things he had been outriding. And he closed his eyes briefly, not in regret, not in sorrow, but in acknowledgement. And when he opened them again, the land before him had not changed, but something inside him had shifted just enough to notice. And far behind him, beyond the curve of distance and dust, the woman who had walked out of Deadwood did not take the road he had taken. She moved instead along a narrower path that cut away from the main trail, one that followed the shape of the land rather than the will of those who had tried to claim it. And her steps were quiet, her pace unhurried, and the silver chain rested against her chest with a weight that no longer felt borrowed. And as she walked, the air carried a faint echo of something older than the town she had left behind, something that did not need names or ownership to exist. And she did not look back either, not because there was nothing there, but because she understood that what had happened did not belong to the place it occurred in. It belonged to the choice that had been made within it, and those choices did not fade with distance. They traveled, unseen, carried in the way a person stood or spoke or chose not to act. And in Deadwood itself, the saloon had begun to fill again, slowly, cautiously, like a space relearning how to hold sound. And the men who had been there earlier did not speak of what had happened, not directly, but their movements carried the memory of it, the way a hand paused before gripping too tight, the way a voice softened where it once would have sharpened, and the rope still lay on the table for a long while before someone finally moved it, not tossing it aside, but lifting it and setting it somewhere out of view, as if removing it from sight might ease the weight it had taken on, though it did not entirely. And the gray-templed man returned to his usual place at the bar, but he did not lean the same way, did not fill the space with the same certainty, because something had been shown to him that could not be unseen. And out on the open land, the light shifted again, turning gold, then fading towards something cooler as evening approached. And Elias guided his horse toward a low rise, a place where the ground lifted just enough to see farther than before. And when he reached the top, he paused, letting the horse rest, letting the world stretch out in front of him without interruption. And for a long moment he simply sat there, the wind moving past him, the sky widening above, and the road continuing forward without promise or demand. And he reached into his coat then, drawing out the folded leather, and he opened it. Once more, not to examine it, not to question it, but to remember. And the marking inside caught the last light of the day, faint but steady, and he held it there for a moment, then closed it again, slower this time, more deliberate, and returned it to its place. And as he did, the sun slipped lower, touching the horizon in a line of quiet fire, and the world around him seemed to hold its breath for just a second before exhaling into evening. And Elias turned his horse forward again, not because he had somewhere to be, but because standing still had given him what he needed. And as he rode on into the fading light, there was no sound behind him, no call, no reason to stop, only the steady rhythm of movement and the understanding that what had been set right did not need to be followed. And somewhere far off, on a different path beneath the same sky, the Apache woman continued on her own way, carrying with her not a debt, not a memory of fear, but the quiet certainty that truth, once spoken, did not need to be defended. It only needed to exist. And between those two paths, stretching across miles of open land and unspoken understanding, the story remained, not as something told, but as something lived, the kind that did not end when the voices faded, but continued in the silence that followed. The night did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly over the land like a quiet agreement, the last light stretching thin before giving way to something deeper. And Elias Crow rode into it without changing his pace, his silhouette fading into the long blue shadows that gathered across the plain, and the sound of his horse carried farther now in the cooler air, steady and unhurried, as if time itself had decided not to rush what had already been set in motion. And somewhere behind him, far enough that distance had softened every detail, Deadwood continued its restless rhythm. But even there the night brought a different kind of stillness, one that settled into the spaces between words, into the pauses men did not know they were taking. And in the saloon, a lantern flickered low against the wall, casting uneven light across the table where the rope had once lain, and though it had been moved, its absence felt louder than its presence had, and the gray-templed man sat alone now, his glass untouched, his gaze not fixed on anything in particular, because the thing he was looking at was not in the room, and the younger man who had spoken earlier stood near the doorway, his hand resting lightly against the frame as if he needed to feel something solid, and after a moment he stepped outside, drawing in a slow breath of the cooler air, and he looked out toward the road, though he could not see the rider who had already passed beyond the reach of sight, and still he stood there longer than necessary, because sometimes a man needed time to understand why something he could not see had changed the way he looked at everything else. And out on the open land, Elias reached a small rise where a single tree stood, its branches thin but steady against the night sky, and he guided his horse toward it, letting the animal rest beneath its sparse cover, and he dismounted with a quiet motion, boots meeting the ground with a soft sound that seemed to disappear as soon as it was made, and for a moment he simply stood there, the vast silence of the plains stretching around him, broken only by the distant call of something unseen moving through the dark, and he reached into his coat once more, drawing out the folded leather, and this time when he opened it, he did not look at the marking right away. He held it in his hands, feeling its edges, its worn surface, the small imperfections that came from time and use, and when he finally looked down, the faint light of the rising moon caught just enough of it to make the pattern visible, not clear, not sharp, but present, and he let out a slow breath, not heavy, not burdened, just steady, and in that moment there was no past pressing against him, no question left unanswered, only the quiet understanding that what had been done could not be undone, and what had been set right did not need to be revisited, and far from him, moving along her own path beneath the same sky, the Apache woman found a place where the land dipped slightly, offering shelter from the wind, and she paused. There, kneeling briefly to touch the ground, as if greeting something older than the path she walked, and when she rose again, her hand moved instinctively to the chain resting against her chest, her fingers brushing over it lightly, and there was no hesitation in the gesture, no doubt, because she did not carry it as a reminder of what had been lost, but as a continuation of something that had been given freely and received without condition. And as she resumed her walk, the night seemed to open around her rather than close in. The darkness not a barrier but a space where things could exist without being seen, and in Deadwood, the saloon door closed for the night with a softer sound than usual, and the men inside drifted away one by one, not speaking of the day, not needing to, because each carried it differently, in the way they would remember a moment not for what was said, but for what had been revealed in its silence. And the gray-templed man remained until the last lantern dimmed, and when he finally stood, his movements were slower, more deliberate, as if he had learned something about the weight of action by witnessing the power of restraint, and outside, the stars had begun to show, scattered across the sky in quiet patterns that did not change for any man or any town, and Elias Crow sat beneath the lone tree. The leather folded once more and returned to its place, and he leaned back slightly, resting against the rough bark, his eyes lifting toward the sky not in search of answers, but in acknowledgement of the vastness that made all questions smaller, and in that stillness, in that space where nothing demanded and nothing resisted, there was a kind of peace that did not need to be earned, only recognized, and when he closed his eyes, it was not to escape anything, but to rest within that understanding, knowing that the road would still be there when he rose again, and that whatever lay ahead would be met the same way as what had been left behind, not with force, not with fear, but with the quiet certainty of a man who knew when to speak, and when to let the silence carry the rest. Morning came without announcement, the way it always did out on the open land, a slow lifting of darkness rather than a sudden arrival of light, and Elias Crow opened his eyes beneath the lone tree as the first pale glow stretched across the horizon, the air cool and still carrying the last breath of night. And for a moment he did not move, not because he was tired, but because there was nothing pressing him forward yet. And in that stillness he listened, to the faint rustle of grass, to the quiet shift of his horse nearby, to the world waking in its own time without asking him to hurry. And then he pushed himself up, brushing the dust from his coat with a motion that had been repeated more times than he could count. And he reached into his coat, not out of habit this time, but with intention, drawing out the folded leather once more, and he held it in the morning light, watching as the faint marking caught the first rays of the sun, clearer now than it had been in the dim light of evening. And there was something about that clarity that felt final, not in the sense of an ending, but in the sense of understanding, and he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something that no longer needed to be questioned, and he folded it again, slower this time, more deliberate, and returned it to its place. And when he mounted his horse, the movement felt lighter, not because the road ahead had changed, but because what he carried into it had, and miles away, following a different line across the land. The Apache woman stepped into that same morning with a quiet steadiness, the chain resting against her chest catching the light in a brief flash as she moved. And she paused for a moment at the edge of a shallow stream, the water moving gently over smooth stones, and she knelt there, dipping her fingers into the cool current, letting it run across her skin as if washing away the last traces of something that had already been left behind. And when she stood again, she did not look back toward Deadwood, not even for a moment, because the place had already given what it could, and there was nothing there that belonged to her anymore. And back in that town, the morning came differently, slower, heavier, the dust settling into the streets as the first doors opened and the first voices rose, and the saloon stood quiet for a while longer than usual, its windows catching the light without reflecting much of it back. And when the gray-templed man finally stepped outside, he did so with a pace that lacked its usual certainty, his gaze drifting across the street as if searching for something that was no longer there. And he stopped for a moment, his eyes settling on the empty stretch of road where the stranger had stood the day before, and he let out a slow breath, not in frustration, not in regret, but in something quieter, something closer to acceptance. And then he turned and walked on, not with the same stride as before, but with one that carried a different weight. And out on the open land, Elias guided his horse along the rising path of the morning, the sun climbing higher behind him, casting his shadow forward now instead of trailing behind, and he followed it without thinking. Because shadows did not lead, they simply marked where a man had been, and ahead of him the land stretched wide and unclaimed, the road bending and shifting with the terrain rather than forcing it into a straight line. And he let the horse choose its footing, trusting the rhythm that had carried them this far. And as the hours passed, the distance between him and the place he had left grew, not just in miles, but in meaning. And yet the moment itself did not fade. It settled into him, not as a burden, not as a memory that demanded revisiting, but as something steady, something that would shape the way he stood when the next moment came that required it. And somewhere far off, moving along her own path, the Apache woman reached higher ground, where the wind carried farther and the view stretched wider, and she paused there, not to rest, but to look, to take in the space ahead of her with a quiet awareness that did not seek to control it. And she touched the chain once more, not out of habit, but out of recognition, and then she let her hand fall, her gaze steady, her steps certain as she continued forward, and between those two distant paths, beneath the same sky and across the same shifting land, the story that had unfolded did not end. It continued in the quiet choices that followed, in the moments where a man or a woman would stand still when it would be easier to step aside, in the words that would be spoken not for their volume, but for their truth. And in the West, where so much was decided by force or fear, it was those quiet moments that carried the deepest weight, the kind that did not leave marks on the ground, but left something far more lasting in the people who witnessed them, whether they understood it at the time or not. By midday the sun stood high and unblinking, flattening the land into long stretches of pale gold and muted green, and Elias Crow rode through it with the same steady rhythm, the kind that did not challenge the day and did not yield to it either. And the road beneath him shifted from packed dirt to loose gravel and back again, bending where the land asked it to bend, never quite straight, never entirely predictable. And he followed it without question, because a man who had learned to listen did not need the road to explain itself, and the wind carried less now, the heat pressing down in a quiet weight that made even distant sounds seem slower, softer, and for a while there was nothing but the movement forward, The steady rise and fall of the horse beneath him, the quiet presence of something settled inside him that no longer demanded attention. And when he reached a narrow crossing where the land dipped toward a dry creek bed, he slowed, guiding the horse down carefully. The stones beneath shifting just enough to remind him that footing mattered more than speed. And at the bottom he paused, not because he had to, but because something in the stillness called for it. And he looked down at the ground where faint tracks crossed the dust, not fresh, not recent, but present enough to be seen by someone who knew how to look. And for a moment he studied them, not tracing, not following, just recognizing. And then he lifted his gaze again, letting it move across the open stretch ahead, and there was no urgency in him. No need to catch up to anything or anyone, because whatever paths crossed or separated did so by their own design. And miles away, under that same unbroken sky, the Apache woman moved along a ridge where the wind had begun to rise again, carrying the scent of distant rain that had not yet arrived. And she paused at the crest, looking out across the land that stretched beyond sight, her eyes steady, her posture grounded, and the chain rested against her chest, warm now from the sun. And when she touched it, it was not to remember, but to acknowledge. And she let her hand fall again, turning slightly to adjust her path as the terrain shifted beneath her feet, and behind her the ridge fell away into shadow, and ahead the light opened into something wide and uncertain. And she stepped into it without hesitation, because uncertainty did not hold the same weight for her anymore, not after what had been faced and named. And back in Deadwood the day had taken hold fully, the streets busier now, voices rising and falling in familiar patterns, and yet beneath it all there remained a subtle difference, something that could not be pointed to but could be felt in the spaces between actions, in the pauses that came where none had existed before. And the gray-templed man stood outside the saloon for a long moment, watching the movement of the town as if trying to see it from a distance he did not physically hold. And when someone spoke to him, he answered, but his voice carried less certainty, less edge, as if the weight of what had passed had settled into him in a way that could not be undone. And he turned eventually, walking away from the saloon without looking back at it, because whatever had been decided there did not need revisiting. And out on the open land, Elias guided his horse up from the creek bed, the incline gradual but steady, and as he reached the top the wind picked up again, cooler now, carrying with it the promise of change. And he adjusted his hat slightly, not to shield from the sun, but from the shift in the air, and his gaze moved across the horizon, taking in the subtle differences in light and shadow that marked the land ahead. And for a moment he allowed himself to stop completely, the horse standing still. Beneath him, the world stretching out in every direction without boundary or claim. And in that pause there was no thought of where he had been or where he was going. Only the present, clear and unburdened. And after a moment he nudged the horse forward again, not because he had to, but because movement was part of who he was, and the land accepted it without resistance. The road unfolding beneath him as it always had, and somewhere far beyond the reach of sight, the Apache woman continued on. Her own path, the distance between them not a separation, but a quiet acknowledgement that not all journeys were meant to converge again, and yet the connection remained, not as something that needed tending, but as something that had already been understood. And between those two distant figures, moving under the same sky and across the same vast expanse, there existed a shared moment that would not fade with time or distance, because it had never depended on either. It had depended on a choice. A simple, quiet choice to stand still when it mattered, to speak when it counted, and to leave the rest to the silence that followed. And in the West, where so much passed unnoticed and unrecorded, it was those moments that shaped everything that came after, even if no one ever spoke of them again. By late afternoon the sky began to shift again, not in color alone but in weight, the light thinning just enough to hint that the day was preparing to step aside. And Elias Crow rode through that change without altering his pace, his presence blending into the land as naturally as the shadows stretching longer with each passing minute. And the road beneath him grew narrower, less defined, until it became nothing more than a suggestion etched into the earth by those who had passed before him. And even that began to fade, leaving only open ground and quiet instinct to guide the way. And he did not hesitate, Because a man who had learned to listen to silence did not need markers to know where to go. And the wind picked up again, cooler now, carrying with it the distant scent of rain that had not yet touched the land. And he lifted his gaze toward the horizon where dark clouds gathered slowly, not threatening, not urgent, just present in the way all things were when they arrived in their own time. And he slowed his horse as the first drop touched the dust, barely enough to leave a mark. And then another followed, and another, until the dry ground began to accept what it had been waiting for without knowing. And Elias let the rain settle over him without seeking shelter, the water darkening his coat, tracing quiet lines down the worn leather. And for a moment he closed his eyes, not to escape, but to feel the change as it happened, because out here, change was not something to resist. It was something to stand within, and miles away, beneath that same gathering sky, the Apache woman reached a small valley where the land dipped into a gentle curve, offering protection from the rising wind, and she paused there, looking up as the first drops fell around her, soft against the earth, and she did not move to avoid them, did not cover herself. She simply stood, letting the rain touch her face, her hands, the silver resting against her chest, and when she looked down, the chain caught the dimming light in a way that felt quieter now, less like something seen and more like something understood, and she pressed her fingers lightly against it, not holding, not clinging, just acknowledging. And then she lowered her hand again, her posture steady, her breath even, as the rain began to fall more fully. And back in Deadwood the storm arrived differently, faster, louder against the wooden roofs and narrow streets, and people moved to close doors, to gather what had been left outside, to prepare for something that would pass whether they were ready or not. And the saloon filled again, not with the same noise as before, but with a different kind of energy, one that carried less certainty and more pause. And the gray-templed man stood near the window, watching the rain streak down the glass in uneven lines, his reflection faint against the movement. And for a moment he reached out, his fingers touching the wood beside the window as if grounding himself in something solid. And he did not speak, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned that not every moment required it. And out on the open land Elias guided his horse toward higher ground as the rain continued, not seeking escape, but choosing a path that allowed him to see farther, to understand the shape of what was coming rather than simply endure it. And when he reached the crest of a low hill he paused again, the rain falling steadily now, soft but persistent, and he looked out across the land as it changed beneath it, the dust settling, the colors deepening, the air shifting into something clearer. And for a moment he allowed himself to remain there, not moving forward, not looking back, just present within the change. And in that stillness there was no question, no doubt, only the quiet recognition that what had been done did not need to be carried any further than it already had been. And as the rain continued to fall, washing the land in a quiet, steady rhythm, the paths that had been walked began to soften, the tracks fading into the earth as if they had never been there. And yet the journey itself did not disappear. It remained in the choices that had been made along it, in the moments where silence had spoken louder than force, and as the storm settled fully across the land, connecting distant places beneath the same sky, Elias Crow and the Apache woman moved forward on their separate paths, no longer bound by the moment that had brought them together, but shaped by it in ways that would not fade with distance or time. And in the West, where the land remembered nothing and everything at once, that was the only kind of mark that ever truly remained. The rain did not last forever. It never did. And by the time the sky began to clear, the land had already changed in ways that could not be seen at first glance. The dust pressed down, the air cooled, the scent of earth rising quiet and steady, and Elias Crow rode through that softened world with the same calm presence. His coat darkened from the storm, his hat carrying the last drops along its brim before they fell away. And the road ahead was no longer marked by what had come before. The tracks erased, the path rewritten by nothing more than water and time. And he did not search for where it had been, because he did not need to. He followed what was in front of him, as he always had. And as the clouds parted, the light returned in a different way, not harsh, not demanding, but clear, stretching across the land with a quiet certainty that did not ask to be noticed. And for a moment he slowed, letting his horse step through a shallow pool where the rain had gathered, the water, reflecting the sky above in broken fragments that shifted with each movement. And he looked down briefly, not at his reflection, but at the way the surface held both the sky and the earth at once. And then he lifted his gaze again, because what mattered was not what could be seen in passing, but what remained when it was gone, and far from him, along a different path where the land had opened into a wide valley washed clean by the same storm. The Apache woman walked with steady steps, the ground beneath her softer now, her path unmarked but certain, and the silver chain rested against her chest, no longer catching the light in sharp flashes, but holding it quietly, the way something worn long enough becomes part of the one who carries it. And she paused once more. Not because she needed to rest, but because there was something in the stillness that called for acknowledgement, and she looked out across the valley where the rain had left its mark not in lines or boundaries, but in a subtle shift that touched everything equally. And she placed her hand lightly against the chain, not as a reminder, not as a question, but as a simple truth, and then she let it fall, her gaze steady as she continued forward. And back in Deadwood the storm had passed as well, leaving behind a town that looked the same at a glance but felt different in ways that could not be easily named. The streets damp, the air clearer, the noise returning in familiar patterns that no longer carried the same certainty, and the saloon door stood open once again, the inside filled with voices that rose and fell, but with pauses between them that had not existed before, and the gray-templed man stood near the bar, his hand resting against the worn wood, not gripping, not claiming, just present. And when someone spoke louder than needed, he did not answer in kind. He simply looked, and the volume lowered without a word, and that small shift, unnoticed by most, carried more weight than any command he had given before. And outside the town the road stretched on, leading away from what had been and toward what would come, and Elias Crow followed it without hesitation, his figure growing smaller against the wide horizon, until he became nothing more than a movement within the land itself. And then even that faded, leaving no mark behind that could be pointed to, no sign that he had ever been there. And yet something remained, not in the ground, not in the air, but in the people who had stood still long enough to witness a moment that asked nothing of them except to see it clearly. And in that clarity, something had shifted, not loud, not dramatic, but lasting. And as the day moved forward and the land dried beneath the returning sun, the paths that had been walked no longer held their shape, but the choices made upon them did, carried quietly in the way a man might pause before acting, or the way a woman might stand her ground without raising her voice. And out here, where justice was often mistaken for force and truth was buried beneath assumption, it did not take a crowd or a weapon to change what mattered. It took one voice, steady and certain, and the courage to let silence follow it. And as the wind moved again across the open land, carrying nothing and everything at once, the story did not end. It simply settled into the world the way all true things do, without announcement, without demand, leaving behind only the quiet understanding that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stand still, speak once, and walk away.